In the heart of winter, grief has claimed a duke and closed every door, except one. A disgraced gentlewoman, a household bound in sorrow, a slow-burning spark that refuses to die. The Mourning Duke. A Regency romance of healing, hidden pain, and the quiet courage to love again, begins now. Chapter 1. The Governess arrives. The snow muffled everything, even the carriage wheels, once a rhythmic thunder over cobbled lanes, now turned silently along the frozen drive. Inside, Miss Rosalind Arden sat ramrod straight, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap, the faded leather of her satchel pressing against her boot. Outside the frosted window, the countryside had vanished into a world of white. Drifts lay thick across the moors, curling over stone walls and drowning hedgerows. Trees loomed like spectres, bare branches encased in ice. And ahead, emerging from the mist, like something conjured from an old Gothic novel, stood Wintour Hall. She had seen grand houses before, London townhouses, country manors with neat lawns and cheerful window panes. But this was something else. The estate rose from the land like a fortress, tall and grey and still. Ivy clung to its stone walls, black and brittle in the cold. The windows, so many windows, were darkened, as though the house itself had closed its eyes and gone to sleep long ago. The gates had groaned when they opened for her, and the porter who had met her at the village had not spoken once since they set off. Rosalind exhaled slowly, watching her breath fog the air inside the carriage. "You are not afraid of a house," she told herself. But she was not sure that was true. She had never been so far north, never been quite so alone, not since the scandal. Her fingers curled around the thin silver chain at her throat, hidden beneath the high collar of her travelling gown. It was an old thing, her mother's, and the only piece of fine jewellery she still possessed. Her gown itself was a sombre grey blue, sensible and high-waisted, with a woolen pelisse lined in rabbit fur for warmth. Practicality had replaced elegance in her wardrobe, just as necessity had replaced choice in her life. She had been a lady's companion once. Now she was a governess, a servant. The carriage came to a halt before the grand front steps of Wintour Hall. Snow clung to the stone columns flanking the entrance. The door did not open. The coachman cleared his throat and stepped down, moving to help her. Rosalind gathered her skirts, stepping carefully into the snow, the cold seeping through the soles of her boots at once. Her breath puffed in pale clouds. Somewhere in the trees, a crow called, harsh and distant. The door opened at last. A thin woman in a black dress and apron stood framed in the archway. Her hair was pinned in a severe knot, her expression unreadable. "Miss Arden?" she asked crisply. Rosalind inclined her head. "Yes." "You'll come this way. His Grace is not to be disturbed this evening. You'll meet the child tomorrow." The house swallowed her whole. Stone corridors, oak-panelled walls, cold air that smelled faintly of lavender and old smoke. No laughter, no light, no warmth. And yet, Rosalind squared her shoulders. She had survived London. She would survive this. Even if the silence of Wintour Hall felt far heavier than any scandal ever had. Rosalind slept little that first night. The bed in her small but neat chamber was narrow, the linens crisp and cold, smelling faintly of soap and lavender. The wind moaned against the stone walls, and somewhere deep within the house, timbers creaked, as though Wintour Hall itself were unsettled by her presence. She lay awake long after the candle burned low, listening to the silence, thick, watchful, expectant. Morning arrived pale and icy. She dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep forest green wool, modestly cut but well tailored, its high waistline accentuating her slender figure without impropriety. She pinned her auburn hair into a smooth chignon at the nape of her neck, allowing only the smallest curl to soften her temple. She told herself it was practical, not vanity, never vanity. Still, she wanted to appear capable. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, led her down a long corridor and stopped before a pair of double doors. "His Grace is in the breakfast room," she said. "He's asked to see you before the day begins." The room beyond was modest by aristocratic standards, panelled in oak, with a fire crackling low in the hearth and pale winter light seeping through the tall windows. A silver tea service sat untouched on the sideboard. No servants stood by, just a single man, tall and imposing, with his back to the door. The Duke turned as they entered. Rosalind felt the moment like a physical blow. He was broader than she had expected, powerfully built, with a controlled stillness that spoke of command and solitude. His dark hair was brushed back from his forehead, though not overly styled, and a faint shadow of stubble traced his strong jaw, lending him a rawness that resisted every trace of elegance. He wore a charcoal wool tailcoat, cut to perfection, over a black waistcoat and snowy white linen shirt, the cravat at his throat tied with precise, almost severe elegance. But it was his eyes that caught her breath. Grey, not pale, storm grey. Sharp, observant, and utterly unreadable. He studied her as one might assess a stranger who had wandered uninvited into a sacred place. "Miss Arden," he said at last, his voice low and even, touched with the faintest northern edge. "You arrived safely." It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace," Rosalind replied, dipping into a respectful curtsy. "Thank you." His gaze flicked briefly to Mrs. Hargreaves, who gave a short nod and quietly withdrew, leaving them alone in the hush. The fire popped. Snow brushed past the window panes. The Duke did not offer her a seat, nor did he take one himself. It was not a conversation of equals. It was a formality, an employer assessing a new hire. "You have reviewed the terms of your employment." "I have." "You will instruct my son in his letters, numbers, and manners. You will not discuss my household beyond these walls. And you will not seek to involve yourself in matters that do not concern you." His words were clipped, careful, as though each one had been weighed. Rosalind met his gaze, steadier than she felt. "I understand my position, Your Grace. I have no intention of overstepping." Something shifted, just slightly, a tightening at the corner of his mouth. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation that she had not wilted beneath his scrutiny. "Good." Silence stretched between them. It was not empty. It hummed. Rosalind became acutely aware of the whisper of her breath, the warmth of the fire behind her, and the way his eyes seemed to linger. Not improperly, but with an intensity that made her skin warm beneath her collar. "My son will not make your work easy," he said abruptly. "Children rarely do," Rosalind answered, her tone mild but pointed. For the briefest instant, something like amusement, quick and dangerous, flickered across his face. Then it was gone. "You may go." Rosalind curtsied once more and turned to leave, the quiet click of her boots echoing on the stone floor. And as she stepped back into the cold hall, she realized, with a strange, unsettling certainty, that the most frozen thing at Wintour Hall was not the land around it. It was the man she had just met. And yet, beneath the ice, something restless stirred. The nursery was not at all what Rosalind expected. She had imagined something grim and cold to match the rest of Wintour Hall. Instead, she found a space that bore traces of life. A tall, mullioned window framed the far wall, its glass clouded by breath fog and frost. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, throwing flickers of gold onto the faded carpet. A scattering of wooden toys, some charmingly handmade, others expensive and neglected, lay beneath a low writing desk. A stuffed bear in a soldier's coat slouched in the corner, clearly well loved. And in the centre of it all, crouched on the window seat with muddy boots and a crooked smirk, was the boy himself. James Redmayne, 5 years old, heir to a dukedom, covered in jam. Rosalind blinked. He was clutching a spoon in one sticky hand, dipping it boldly into a glass jar of plum preserves. His dark curls were in disarray, his cheeks flushed with mischief, and the collar of his little waistcoat was stained red and purple like some sort of battlefield injury. A trail of footprints, muddy and unmistakable, led from the hearthrug to the window seat and back again, passing over what had once been a pristine white cushion. "That's not for you," he said matter-of-factly, pointing the spoon at her like a weapon. "This is the jam spoon. The governess doesn't get jam." Rosalind folded her hands before her and tilted her head. "Is that so?" "Yes. The last one hated jam. She said it was unsanitary." He wrinkled his nose in imitation, then resumed eating. "But I like it." "It would seem so." "You're not very tall," he added, licking the spoon. "Or old. That's suspicious." Rosalind blinked at him. "Would you prefer I return when I'm ancient and towering?" He considered this, swinging his legs idly against the panelled wall. "Maybe. Can you do sums?" "Yes. Latin. Enough." "Do you hate children?" "Only the dreadful ones." "I'm dreadful." Rosalind stepped further into the room. "You're trying to be dreadful," she said, lifting a cushion and dusting it off. "That's not quite the same." He narrowed his eyes. "You talk funny." "You mean I speak clearly?" "You'll leave, you know." He said it so casually that it might have been a prediction about the weather. Not a plea, not a fear. Simply fact. Rosalind sat, smoothing her skirts. "Do you want me to?" A pause. James looked away, licking the edge of the spoon. "Doesn't matter." But it did. She saw it in the twitch of his small jaw, in the way his mouth flattened with practiced indifference. Too young to have such old armour. "Well," Rosalind said softly, "that's inconvenient for you. I intend to stay." James tilted his head. His eyes, grey like his father's but brighter, quicker, studied her with a child's ruthless honesty. Then, with sudden decisiveness, he leapt down from the window seat, stomped across the room and handed her the spoon. Sticky. Warm. Slightly absurd. "Fine. You can have some jam," he announced. "But if you eat all of it, I'll poison your tea." Rosalind accepted the spoon with a perfectly serious nod. "A generous offer. I shall treasure it." James grinned, and just like that, the first barrier between them cracked. Chapter 2. Whispers in the West Wing. It was the kind of house that held secrets. Rosalind had always believed that stone did not forget, not truly. A house like Wintour Hall, with its vaulted ceilings and groaning staircases, did not merely stand. It watched. It listened. And somewhere inside, it remembered. That afternoon, with her lessons finished and James having retreated, mysteriously, to the stables in search of something called the Catapult Incident, Part 2, Rosalind wandered. She kept her steps light on the parquet floors, mindful of propriety. She told herself it was important for a governess to know the layout of the house in case of emergency. She ignored the little voice in her head that whispered, "You are looking for her, the Duchess." The hallways grew quieter the farther she strayed from the nursery wing. Dust hung in the corners here, undisturbed. Curtains were drawn tight against the light. The air cooled perceptibly. A long gallery stretched out ahead of her, lined with portraits in heavy gilt frames, ancestral faces watching her with expressions of grim grandeur. There were Redmaynes here, lords, generals, scholars. The Duke's ancestors, she presumed. One wore a breastplate and lace cravat. Another cradled a hunting rifle beside a large and deeply miserable-looking hound. At the far end of the corridor, she reached a door. Unlike the others, it was locked. Rosalind tried the handle once, lightly, respectfully. It did not budge. It was not just closed. It had been deliberately sealed. The frame was wider than the others, the door itself older with iron inlays. A small white thread, cobweb or thread from a forgotten curtain, hung loose near the hinge. She reached out to touch it when, "You won't find her there." Rosalind turned sharply. A maid, young red-haired, plainly startled to have been noticed, stood in the side passage, a basket of linens in her arms. "Pardon?" Rosalind asked. The maid hesitated. She flushed. "Nothing, miss. Just no one goes in there anymore. Not since—" She broke off, clearly regretting the words. "I've said too much. Apologies." "Is that the Duchess's wing?" "It was. Before." A silence passed between them, thick with things unsaid. "Was she—" Rosalind began, then stopped herself. "Forgive me. I shouldn't pry." "No, miss. It's not that. It's just—" The maid's voice dropped to a whisper. "She was kind. That's all. Most of us liked her. That room. They say he hasn't touched it since the funeral. Won't let anyone go in. Not even to clean." Rosalind glanced again at the door. She didn't believe in ghosts. But she did believe in grief. And grief, she knew, had its own way of haunting the living. "Thank you," she said gently. The maid curtsied quickly and hurried off, her footsteps fading down the passageway. Rosalind remained a moment longer. Then, with a final glance at the locked door and the quiet hallway, she turned. And as she did, her eyes caught on a portrait she hadn't seen before. It was tucked slightly off-centre, beside a narrow window. Smaller than the others. More intimate. A woman, seated in profile, her head turned just enough to catch the viewer's gaze. Her hair was raven dark, her skin pale and luminous. A white gown fell in delicate folds over her frame, and her expression, calm, secretive, held something that struck Rosalind hard in the chest. Beauty, yes, but also melancholy. And in her eyes, a shadow of the same silence she'd seen in the Duke. There was no placard, no name, but she knew. The late Duchess of Wintour. Rosalind stepped closer. The woman's painted gaze seemed to meet hers. And for a breathless moment, Rosalind felt like an intruder in another woman's story. Dinner was not an invitation. It was a summons. Rosalind had spent the afternoon reviewing James's unruly handwriting and coaxing him into reading aloud from Aesop's fables. An effort interrupted only twice, once by the sudden appearance of a frog in his writing desk, and again by the discovery that someone had tied all her quills into a tight knot with a strip of twine. By the time Mrs. Hargreaves appeared with her thin-lipped smile and a pointed instruction, "His Grace expects you in the small dining room at 7. Punctuality is valued at Wintour Hall." Rosalind had already guessed it wasn't a social courtesy. She returned to her room with just enough time to change, selecting a gown of soft plum wool with a square neckline and silk ribbon detailing at the cuffs. Modest, but flattering. Her only jewellery was a small garnet brooch at her throat. Her boots were polished, her posture perfect, her resolve steady. She reminded herself, "You are not here as a guest. You are staff, but you are not small. You are not invisible." The small dining room was a long, narrow space, its windows tall and curtained, the table polished to a mirror sheen. A silver candelabrum burned at the centre, its flames steady and golden. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows up the walls. Only 2 places had been set. The Duke stood as she entered. "Miss Arden," he said, with a slight inclination of his head. He was dressed in black this evening, an impeccably tailored coat and waistcoat, with a jet cravat that made his already sharp features seem carved in marble. "Your Grace," she returned, dipping into a practised curtsy. He gestured to the seat opposite his own. She took it with quiet grace, smoothing her skirts beneath her. The footman appeared with a tureen of soup, parsnip and leek, garnished with a curl of cream. Rosalind sipped, waiting for him to speak. He didn't. The silence stretched. Not hostile, but impenetrable. She risked a glance at him, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere near the fire. He looked tired, though not in a way he would ever admit. Tired like stone, worn smooth by time. "James was particularly energetic today," she offered at last. "He often is," the Duke replied, his tone unreadable. "He's intelligent." "Too much so." A pause. The footman served roast duck with winter greens and fig compote. It was exquisite, rosy pink and tender, but Rosalind barely tasted it. "He told me," she said carefully, "that the last governess objected to jam. The last governess objected to everything. And yet, I find it difficult to object to plum preserves." That earned her a glance, not quite a smile, but something shifted. And then, a sudden sharp snap rang out beneath the table. Rosalind jumped. The Duke sat bolt upright. Then a hiss, click, clack, ping, and a small puff of white flour exploded from beneath the tablecloth, directly beneath the footman, who dropped the gravy boat with a sharp curse. "Good God!" the Duke barked, half rising. The footman flushed scarlet. A silver serving spoon skidded across the carpet. Somewhere nearby, perhaps behind the door, a small, muffled giggle echoed faintly, like a ghost with an excellent sense of timing. Rosalind composed herself with heroic restraint. "I believe," she said delicately, brushing a speck of flour from her sleeve, "we have been outwitted by a child." The Duke's jaw tightened, but not with rage. For one wild moment, he looked as though he might actually laugh. He booby-trapped the dining room. And quite effectively. He'll be flogged. He'll be delighted. The Duke stared at her, and then, for the first time since she'd arrived, his expression cracked. A huff of breath, almost a laugh, almost. Then it vanished. "I apologize," he said curtly. "He's undisciplined." "He's lonely," Rosalind said softly. "That's not quite the same thing." His eyes snapped to hers, storm grey, piercing. The silence between them was suddenly not empty, but charged. A beat passed, another. "You presume much," he said. "Perhaps," she replied, "but I'm often right." By the time dinner ended, the storm was in full force. Rain whipped across the windows like thrown gravel, and the old house creaked in places that had been silent for years. Rosalind returned to the nursery to check on James. He wasn't there. His boots were gone, and the fire had burned low. A chair had been dragged slightly out of place, too heavy for him to move easily, which meant he'd tried to climb on it. The door had been left open. She checked the hall. Nothing. No sign of him in the drawing room. Not in the schoolroom either. The kitchens had already banked their fire for the night. Then she spotted it. A thin trail of dusty footprints across the floor, leading down the gallery. Small, barefoot. Headed somewhere he shouldn't be. Her pulse ticked faster. She followed quickly, passing oil portraits and unlit sconces. The hall grew colder. She didn't need directions. There was only one place in the house that felt this far removed. The west wing. The door, usually shut, now hung slightly open. "James?" she called, trying to keep her voice even. No answer. She stepped into the room beyond. It had once been a private sitting room by the look of it. The furnishings were still covered with dust cloths. A pale rug stretched across the wooden floor. The curtains were closed, but wind leaked through the windows all the same. James sat cross-legged near the fireplace, facing away from her. He was quiet, his shoulders hunched. "You shouldn't be in here," Rosalind said. He didn't look up. "It's not locked." "Still," she said, "it's not for children. She used to sit here, my mother. That's what Hannah told me." He paused, then added, "I just wanted to see it." She moved closer, sat beside him. There was a portrait on the wall. A woman in white, seated near a piano, her expression calm and still. Not dramatic, not eerie, just ordinary, lifelike. Rosalind didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The door creaked again. The Duke stood there. His shoulders were wet from the rain. He hadn't dressed for the storm, hadn't taken the time. He looked between them, then at the painting. "I've told you not to come in here," he said to James. His voice was low, but sharp. James turned. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. You're not to be here." "It's just a room." That silenced the Duke. Not because the boy was right, necessarily, but because there wasn't a good argument ready. Rosalind stood. "He's not hurting anything, and he came on his own." The Duke looked at her. "You think I'm being unreasonable?" "I think you're upset." There was a pause. The wind pushed hard against the window panes. Somewhere behind them, a shutter banged. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked back at James. Something about his expression softened, barely, but Rosalind caught it. "Come on," he said to the boy. "It's late." James got up. No protest. He walked past his father without a word. The Duke watched him go, jaw tight, but he didn't stop him. Rosalind followed. They didn't speak on the walk back to the nursery. The house felt smaller somehow, less distant, as though a door had opened, even if no one quite admitted it. When she reached her room, the fire was already lit. Someone had left a fresh towel on the foot of her bed. She sat down, unpinned her hair, and listened to the storm pass. Chapter 3. Fireside Lessons. The first lesson began with a sword fight. Not a real one, of course, but James had gotten hold of 2 fireplace pokers and was brandishing them with considerable flair when Rosalind walked into the schoolroom the next morning. "En garde," he declared, lunging at a footstool. "Good morning," Rosalind said, setting her books down. "Are you dueling furniture or just warming up?" He turned, grinning, curls wild and shirt untucked. "You're late." "I'm exactly on time." "That's boring." She took a deep breath. "Today we begin with arithmetic." "That's very boring." "That depends on your attitude." James flopped dramatically into a chair, crossing his arms like a miniature despot. "I hate numbers." "Do you hate being outsmarted?" His eyes narrowed. "No." Rosalind picked up the slate and chalk. "Then prove it." She handed him a riddle written in tidy script. "I am a number. Double me and subtract 6, and you get 14. What am I?" He stared at it. "What kind of number is this? A riddle number?" "A clever one, like you." He looked suspicious, then intrigued. She turned away and let him puzzle over it in silence. When she looked back, he was scribbling furiously on the edge of the slate, muttering under his breath. "Right, double. That's 2 of something. 14. Subtract." 5 minutes later, he slapped the slate down with something like triumph. 10. "Correct," she said calmly. He blinked, then smiled, wide and unguarded. "You're not as bad as the others," he said. "I'm honored." "One of them made me copy the alphabet 30 times because I asked if she'd ever been bitten by a goose." A fair question. That's what I said. They moved on to reading. He stumbled a bit. He was clever, but not yet focused. She didn't scold. She asked questions, let him find the answers himself. He began sitting straighter. His jokes came faster. By the time the fire had burned down to coals, he'd nearly forgotten he was learning. When the clock struck noon, he glanced up, startled. "We're done?" "For today." That was quick. Rosalind raised an eyebrow. "It was 2 hours." "Oh." He looked vaguely disappointed, then quickly tried to hide it. "Well," he said, shrugging, "tomorrow I'll be terrible again." "I expect no less." He grinned and bolted from the room, boots thudding down the hallway. Rosalind stayed behind a moment longer, watching the chalk dust drift through the air. He was exhausting and impossible. And something else, too. Capable of learning to trust, but only if someone didn't give up on him first. The kitchen was warmer than anywhere else in the house. It smelled of baking bread, coal smoke, and something sweet, probably the apple tarts cooling on the rack by the window. Rosalind had never been invited below stairs at any of her previous posts. Governesses were meant to hover in the space between staff and family, belonging to neither. But Mrs. Hargreaves had wordlessly set out a second cup of tea on the kitchen table, and Rosalind had taken that as the closest thing to permission she was going to get. "Sugar?" the housekeeper asked. "Yes, thank you, just one." Mrs. Hargreaves poured without comment. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, with a no-nonsense knot of greying hair and sleeves always pushed to the elbow. She looked like she could stop a kitchen fire with one hand and field a scandal with the other. "The boy's still in one piece, then?" "He is, and still convinced I'm secretly an assassin hired to poison his jam." That got the closest thing to a smile Rosalind had seen from her. "He's tried worse. I once found a squirrel in the linen press." They drank quietly for a moment. Somewhere in the back corridor, a maid was humming as she folded linens. "How long have you been with the family?" Rosalind asked. 22 years. I served the Duke's mother before him, helped carry him into the world if you want to know the truth." Rosalind looked down into her teacup. "May I ask about the previous Duchess?" Mrs. Hargreaves glanced at her, not unkindly. "You may ask. Doesn't mean you'll get much." Rosalind didn't push. After a pause, the older woman spoke again, quieter this time. "Her name was Lillian. She was from Hampshire, a vicar's daughter. Not what the peerage expected, but she had spirit, sharp as a whip. She died 3 years ago. A fever, quick and cruel." Rosalind nodded. She hadn't expected lurid gossip, but the simplicity of it still struck her. Did James know her well? Well enough to miss her. He was barely 2 when it happened, barely weaned. She kept him close, wouldn't let a wet nurse near him. I think he remembers pieces, smells, songs, her hands, but not her voice. That's what I notice. He doesn't remember being sung to. The statement landed heavier than Rosalind expected. Mrs. Hargreaves set her cup down. "The Duke changed after she died. No surprise there. Shut half the house, stopped hosting anyone. He's not cruel, not really. But he doesn't let anything in. Not light, not company, not even himself some days. And James. The boy acts out because someone has to." That stopped Rosalind cold. It was the most honest sentence she'd heard since stepping into Wintour Hall. They sat quietly a while longer. The fire cracked in the grate. Someone clanged a pot in the scullery. "You're the first governess who hasn't run for the door," Mrs. Hargreaves said, almost offhand. "I've thought about it," Rosalind admitted. "Then you're not a fool. But you're still here." Rosalind offered a faint smile. "I'm stubborn." "Good. He needs stubborn." It was late afternoon when Rosalind returned to the schoolroom. The snow outside had grown heavier again, the light dim and silvery. A fire had been lit, and James was already there, half curled in the armchair closest to the hearth, a book open on his lap, and a smudge of charcoal on the tip of his nose. He didn't look up when she entered. "I already read the first 3 pages," he said. "Did you understand them?" "No." She crossed the room and took the seat opposite him. "Then we'll start again." For the next hour, the only sound was the fire crackling, the pages turning, and James stumbling through the fable of the town mouse and the country mouse with fierce concentration. He mispronounced hospitality twice, gave up entirely on unceremoniously, and insisted on renaming the country Mouse Cheddar, but he got through it. "They were both kind of annoying," he announced when they finished. "What do you mean?" "Well, one thought he was better than everyone, and the other just wanted to live in a hole. They could have both done better." "That's a very diplomatic conclusion." James looked faintly pleased with himself. "I'm probably the best student you've ever had." "I have no doubt," she said dryly. He grinned, but didn't argue. He leaned his head against the back of the chair, legs sprawled over the armrest, the book still clutched in one hand. For a moment, he was just a boy, not the heir to anything, not the child of a grieving household, just James. And just outside the doorway, silent, unnoticed, the Duke watched. He hadn't meant to. He had come to the schoolroom with the vague intention of checking on progress, asking after James's behaviour, perhaps even correcting it if needed. But when he'd approached the door, he'd heard their voices. No shouting, no arguing, just reading, conversation, familiarity, and something else. His son was smiling. Rosalind had not seen him there. She was bent forward slightly, elbow on the armrest, chin resting in her hand. Not soft, but focused. Present. James was speaking animatedly now about a scheme to build a trap for the next governess. "But maybe I'll just make her think it's a trap." And she laughed. Not politely, not carefully. It was quiet and warm and unguarded. Alexander stepped back before he was noticed. Back into the hall, where the snow pressed against the glass and the world returned to silence. Chapter 4. A Masquerade of Manners. The news arrived on a Thursday, just after the midday meal. "Lady Juliet Redmayne will be joining His Grace for supper," Mrs. Hargreaves announced, her voice clipped, hands folded at her waist. "She'll take the green suite." Rosalind, who had been trying to coax James into reviewing his spelling list, paused mid-syllable. "That's his cousin," the boy said, before Rosalind could ask. He didn't look up from his paper. "She smells like roses and talks about opera and always wants to kiss me on the face." "You must be thrilled," Rosalind said. "I am devising something," he replied. She looked at him. "Something unwise?" "That rather depends on your meaning of the word." She narrowed her eyes. "Does it involve flour?" He gave a small, entirely unconvincing shrug. "It might." Mrs. Hargreaves cleared her throat. "There will be a formal supper. Staff will remain in their quarters unless summoned." She did not look at Rosalind as she spoke, yet the implication lingered in the air like a winter draft. "You are not family. You are not invited. You know your place." Rosalind inclined her head. "Of course." When she left the room a moment later, James slipped after her. "You should go," he said. "I mean, supper's dull, but you'd make it less awful." "I'm not expected to attend." James glanced around, then leaned in a little. "Well, I'm not going either, officially." Rosalind raised an eyebrow. "Unofficially?" He gave her a look far too innocent to be trusted. "Let's just say the evening might not go entirely to plan." "James, it's nothing terrible, just festive." She folded her arms. Does this festive plan involve flour? He looked wounded. Why must you always assume it's flour? Experience. He grinned, then sobered. Still, you should go. I'm not sure it would be welcome. I think it would, he said. Lady Juliet always wears a hat that looks like a turkey. Or maybe it isn't supposed to. But it definitely does. I think you could wear something better. Rosalind snorted. I'm not entering a millinery contest with your cousin. But you could, if you wanted. She looked at him then. He was trying not to fidget, which meant he was actually nervous. Why do you care if I'm there? James hesitated. Because it's always quiet when she comes. Not in a good way. And I think you'd say something interesting. Rosalind didn't answer right away. She thought of the way the Duke had looked at her the day before, of how James was changing, how the house was changing, and how she too was beginning to change. I'll consider it, she said. Good. Then, after a beat, also, if I need a distraction during the prank, you could spill something. That wasn't part of the deal. There was a deal? There is now. You don't use actual livestock this time. James sighed. You're no fun. I'm fun within reason. That's not fun at all. He grinned, then ran off. Probably to hide jam in someone's gloves. Rosalind turned back toward the corridor, her thoughts already drifting to the contents of the wardrobe upstairs. She hadn't worn anything formal in nearly a year, but suddenly, she wanted to. The borrowed gown had once belonged to the Duke's late mother. Mrs. Hargreaves said so quietly, as she opened the wardrobe in one of the disused guest rooms where Rosalind sometimes kept her spare things. The dress had been wrapped in muslin, carefully stored away. Rosalind recognized the feel of fine silk through the layers before she even saw it. You're not expected at supper, the housekeeper said, not looking her in the eye. But the boy told his Grace you might attend. Rosalind froze. He told him? In the boy's usual way, loudly, and while climbing the stair banister. She almost smiled, then stopped herself. And his Grace approved? He didn't say no. That was as close to an invitation as she was going to get. Rosalind lifted the dress carefully from its wrappings. It was deep blue silk, trimmed with black velvet, with a modest neckline and delicate embroidery at the sleeves, tasteful and restrained, but unmistakably elegant. The kind of gown that spoke of position, not flash. It had the look of something meant to be worn in candlelight. She dressed slowly, thoughtfully. Her own gloves were worn and patched. She left them off. Her shoes were polished, though the sole of one was beginning to lift. She tied her hair into a smooth twist, letting one soft curl fall loose at her temple, not carelessly, but by choice. When she looked in the mirror, she did not see a governess. She saw herself. Someone who had known comfort once. Someone who had not always moved in silence. Someone who remembered what it was like to be seen. She expected to feel nervous when she entered the dining room, but what she felt instead was steady, as though she'd stepped into the shape of something she used to wear well. The dining room was lit with candles and a large fire. The table had been set with the best silver. A footman stood by the sideboard, and the scent of roasted game and wine lingered in the air. Lady Juliet was already seated. She was, to Rosalind's mild surprise, not particularly intimidating. Lovely, yes, in that slightly overpainted way fashionable women often were. She wore lilac silk with too many frills and a matching turban that tilted slightly to the left, giving her the unfortunate look of a smug pheasant. "Oh," Lady Juliet said, as Rosalind entered. "You must be the governess." Rosalind offered a polite nod. "Miss Arden, a pleasure." Juliet turned back to the Duke, clearly dismissing her. But the Duke had not looked away. His eyes tracked Rosalind from the door to the table. He stood politely, but there was something else beneath the gesture. He was watching her in a way that felt different. Not surprised, not disapproving, attentive. "Miss Arden," he said, voice calm. "I'm glad you could join us." She took her seat. The borrowed gown whispered as she moved. Her hands were steady on the linen napkin. She did not blush. She did not bow her head. And across the table, the Duke did not look away. The first half of supper was quiet. Lady Juliet did most of the talking, an endless stream of updates from London society, who had married poorly, who had run off disgracefully, who had taken up radical literature and should be watched closely. She referred to the Prime Minister as tiresome, her dressmaker as a visionary, and to James, who was not present, as that wild little creature. Rosalind said little. She didn't need to. The Duke, for his part, was unusually reserved. He nodded, offered dry observations when pressed, but his attention flicked again and again across the table, toward Rosalind. He was watching her quietly, his expression unreadable, but no longer indifferent. When Juliet turned to him, he answered her. When Rosalind spoke, however briefly, he listened. It did not go unnoticed. "My dear cousin," Juliet said at one point, a sharp smile playing at her lips. "How very progressive of you, inviting the governess to supper." "James insisted," he said simply. Rosalind almost said something, but she caught the flicker of something under his words. Humour, maybe, or defence. So she left it. The second course arrived. Roast duck with parsnips and red currant sauce. The footman moved around the table, serving carefully. Rosalind reached for her wine glass. And that was when it happened. A snap echoed beneath the table, followed by a loud pop and a sudden rush of white smoke. For a split second, everything froze. Then the centre of the tablecloth collapsed inward, yanked down by some invisible pulley, and an entire bowl of red currant sauce launched itself across the table, hitting Lady Juliet squarely on the bodice. She let out a shriek as crimson streaked across her lilac silk. Rosalind's wine sloshed. The footman dropped a fork. The Duke stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. Juliet was still shrieking. "What on earth? What is this? This nonsense? I've been attacked." Rosalind swallowed hard and looked down. There, under the table, attached by string to a not quite hidden mechanism of bent wire, candle wax, and what looked like a repurposed mousetrap, was a perfectly designed prank device. James had built a catapult. "Oh no," Rosalind murmured. The Duke turned toward her. "You know something about this?" "Only that I told him not to use livestock." He blinked. Just once. Then he pressed a hand to his brow. "Excuse me," he muttered, and left the room. Juliet sat in stunned silence, dabbing at her chest with a napkin, muttering something about absolutely feral children. Rosalind rose slowly, unsure whether to follow or stay. But the footman was already removing the wreckage, and Juliet was still glowering. Outside in the hall, she found the Duke halfway to the stairs. "He'll be in the library," she said, "waiting to see if you're angry." He paused, then glanced at her. "And should I be?" She looked at him carefully. "Do you want to be?" Their eyes held. It was the first time they'd stood so close without any excuse. No child, no lesson, no argument. Just a hallway lit by low sconces and the stillness that followed chaos. She felt it in the space between them, charged, heavy, but quiet. His hand brushed her sleeve as he passed. Not intentional, not lingering, but she felt it. "You're not like the others," he said. And before she could answer, he turned and disappeared down the corridor. Chapter 5. The Garden That Was Hers. She found it by accident. It was a few days after the supper, The weather had warmed slightly, and Rosalind, restless after lessons and tired of the dim corridors, had wandered farther than usual down the south path that edged the orchard. There, half hidden behind a row of overgrown hedges, was the greenhouse. The glass was clouded with grime, ivy had climbed most of the eastern wall, and a tree branch had cracked one of the upper panes, but it was still standing, still intact. She pushed open the door. It groaned on its hinges. The air inside smelled like damp earth, old cedar, and something floral beneath it all, faded but still clinging on. The warmth from the stone path had been caught beneath the glass, and it wrapped around her like a held breath. Along the shelves were rows of empty pots, broken tools, cracked watering cans. A few stubborn plants, mostly herbs, still struggled in the corners. But there were signs this place had once been cared for. Rosalind took a deep breath, rolled up her sleeves, and began to clear a small section of the work table. She wasn't sure why exactly. She only knew that it felt good to touch something real, to sweep away the dust, to tend to something that might grow. By the third afternoon, she had scrubbed one entire row of the planting table, cleared a cluster of wild vines from the back wall, and coaxed a handful of sprouting bulbs into proper pots. It wasn't beauty yet, but it was becoming something. That was when she heard the sneeze. A loud, unmistakably guilty sneeze. She turned. James was crouched beneath the back bench, covered in leaves and soil, clutching what appeared to be a stolen biscuit and a rather alarming pair of gardening shears. "This is my hiding place," James declared, bristling with indignation. "It's mine now," Rosalind replied evenly. "You cannot simply take it," James protested. "You weren't using it properly," Rosalind said. He narrowed his eyes. "And how precisely does one misuse a hiding place?" James asked. "By leaving a trail of biscuit crumbs. Obvious, really," Rosalind replied. James considered this, then sighed and crawled out, brushing at his trousers with mild disdain. "It used to be my mother's," he said quite suddenly. That stopped her. He hadn't said it with any particular weight, no warning, no defensiveness. Just quiet truth. "She used to grow things," James added with a little shrug. "But no one comes here now." "I think she'd like it that someone does," Rosalind said gently. James looked down at the half-potted row of bulbs. "They're probably all dead," he muttered. "Not all of them," Rosalind replied. He didn't argue. Instead, he found a hand trowel, sat down beside her, and began scooping soil into a cracked terracotta pot. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that settles when no one feels the need to fill the air with words. Rosalind didn't ask questions. James didn't explain anything. When the sun dipped low and the glass began to mist, she gathered their tools. James looked disappointed when she said it was time to go. "Tomorrow?" he asked, glancing up at her. "If you like," Rosalind said. He nodded, then dashed off, vanishing into the trees like a boy who hadn't just admitted to enjoying himself. Rosalind watched the path for a moment after he disappeared, then turned back toward the greenhouse. It was a mess. It smelled of mildew and moss. But for the first time since arriving at Wintour Hall, she felt as though she had found a place that was hers. It was nearly dusk when he found her. Rosalind had returned to the greenhouse alone after the day's lessons. James had been unusually focused, almost suspiciously so, but had promised he'd come back tomorrow with a surprise, which she took as either a gift or a trap. The greenhouse was warmer than she remembered, the afternoon sun trapped beneath the glass. She'd tied her apron over her gown and pushed the sleeves to her elbows. A small smudge of soil streaked across her cheek. She was humming to herself, a habit she'd thought long abandoned, and carefully repotting a stubborn root that refused to sit straight. She didn't hear the footsteps until someone cleared his throat. She turned, startled, one hand still buried in the soil. The Duke stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, as though he hadn't quite decided whether to enter. His coat was open over a waistcoat of dark green, the fabric softened at the edges, like it had been worn on long walks. He looked less formal than usual, still composed, still self-contained, but not unreadable. "I didn't expect to find anyone here," the Duke said. "Neither did I," Rosalind replied. He glanced past her, taking in the pots, the cleared bench, the trimmed ivy. "You've been working," he observed. "It needed it," she said. "It hasn't been touched in years," he murmured. "That was obvious," Rosalind answered. There was a beat of silence. Not uncomfortable, but not quite easy either. "It was my wife's," he said. "She spent hours in here. Said things grew here because she asked them to, not because they were told." Rosalind looked back at the root in her hands. She adjusted it gently, then patted the soil around it. "She sounds stubborn," she said. That earned a short breath, half amusement, half memory. "She was," the Duke said. He stepped further inside. The door creaked shut behind him. "James said he found you here," he continued. "I didn't mean to take his hiding place," Rosalind replied. "He's reluctantly agreed to share it." "That's generous of him," he said. She smiled faintly. "I think he just wants access to the tools." His gaze shifted, no longer at her hands or the work table, but at her, fully and without distraction. "You're different with him," he said, "than the others were." Rosalind looked at him for a moment. "He needs something different." He paused, not startled, but thoughtful. "He's difficult," he said at last. "He's 5, she replied. The moment held between them, honest, not confrontational. Rosalind wiped her hands on a cloth, then reached for her shawl from the peg near the door. Her fingers brushed the window frame, catching briefly. He moved before she could adjust, his hand steadying hers. Just a touch, bare skin, warm. She looked up, and he was closer than she'd thought. Not too close, but close enough. His eyes weren't unreadable now. They were tired and sharp, and very aware of her. "I'll finish here," Rosalind said. "It'll be easier for James to make a mess if things are in order." He nodded, but he didn't leave right away. And when he did, she didn't look back. Not until she was sure he was gone. The next morning, Rosalind returned to the greenhouse early. She hadn't slept well. The memory of the Duke's hand on hers, steady, unguarded, had stayed with her longer than she liked. Not because of what it meant, but because of what it did to her. James arrived not long after, clutching a small linen-wrapped parcel and tracking mud down the path like a triumphant explorer. "I brought cake," he announced proudly, unwrapping it with great ceremony. "From Cook. I told her it was for educational purposes." "What kind of education is that?" Rosalind asked. "A delicious one," James said. They sat on the edge of the planting bench, eating in companionable silence. The greenhouse was slowly coming back to life. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and thyme. Rosalind had cleared a corner near the window and planted new bulbs there the day before. They hadn't bloomed yet, but they would. "Did she like it?" James asked suddenly. Rosalind looked up. "Who?" "My mother. The greenhouse," he said. "I think so," Rosalind replied softly. "It feels like a place someone would love." James was quiet for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "I don't remember her face. I keep trying to. I remember her perfume, maybe, or the sound she made when she laughed, but not her face." Rosalind didn't answer right away. "That's not unusual," she said gently. "You were very young." "Father never talks about her," James said, "not even when I ask." Rosalind wiped her fingers on a handkerchief and set the rest of the cake aside. "He misses her," she said. "That doesn't always look the way we think it should." "He looks angry," James muttered. "Sometimes missing someone feels like anger," Rosalind said quietly. James nodded, but his brow remained furrowed. He wasn't entirely convinced. "Did you ever lose someone?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes." He didn't ask who, and she didn't say. That was enough. A shadow moved at the edge of the doorway. She turned. The Duke stood just outside, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. Rosalind wasn't sure how long he had been there. "I didn't mean to interrupt," the Duke said. "You didn't," Rosalind replied. But something in him had shifted. Whatever quiet openness had existed in the greenhouse the day before, it was gone now. She saw it in his eyes, in the way his jaw tightened slightly when he looked at his son. "James," he said, "come." The boy looked at Rosalind, then back at his father. "We were—" "Now, please," the Duke said. There was no heat in his voice, just finality. James stood. Rosalind said nothing. She watched the boy go, his steps a little heavier than usual. The Duke didn't follow him immediately. He looked at her, not with anger, not even reproach, but with something closer to fear. Then he turned and walked away. Rosalind stood in the still warm greenhouse, the half-finished cake beside her, and for the first time since coming to Wintour Hall, she didn't know what she was supposed to do next. Chapter 6. A Scandal Revisited. The letter arrived with the afternoon post. It was plain, cream-coloured, unremarkable, except for the London stamp and the slightly slanted hand that made Rosalind's stomach twist, though she couldn't have said why at first. She didn't open it in the drawing-room, or in the schoolroom, where James was elbow-deep in a botched geometry lesson. She waited until she was alone in her room, the door closed, the fire low. She unfolded the page and froze. Mrs. Newcombe, her former employer. The woman who had dismissed her without public explanation, but with just enough coldness to ensure the scandal that followed never quite cleared. "Miss Arden, I trust this finds you in adequate health and employment. I write with a matter of some urgency. Certain parties in London, including Lady Bellingham, have taken an interest in your whereabouts. While I am no longer responsible for your placement, your past association with my agency continues to reflect upon our name. I urge you to take care. Further entanglements with titled households may invite more scrutiny than you can afford. I trust you will understand the implications of this note. A Newcombe Agency for Domestic Placement. No greeting, no warmth. Just a veiled threat dressed in professional concern. Rosalind let the letter drop to her lap. It was happening again. She had worked so hard to keep Wintour Hall separate from that life, to stay small, unnoticed, quietly useful. But London didn't forget. And Lady Bellingham, of all people, who had flirted with scandal for sport, had never forgiven Rosalind for overhearing a conversation that was never meant to be repeated. She had repeated nothing, and yet she'd still been punished. She didn't wonder how Lady Bellingham had found her. That sort of woman never searched alone. There were always men willing to follow carriages, read parish logs, or ask idle questions in servants' halls, especially when well paid to do so. Rosalind folded the letter once, slowly, and tucked it back into its envelope. Then into the drawer of her writing desk, beneath a clean stack of paper she hadn't used since arriving. For the rest of the afternoon her hands were steady, her voice measured. She corrected James's spelling without snapping, helped him rewrite a story about a knight who battled a biscuit monster, even laughed when he told her she had serious governess eyebrows. But she felt it under her skin, the shift, like a seam tearing in fabric, quiet, but certain. At supper, the Duke asked if she would be continuing James's arithmetic lessons over the winter. "Of course," she replied. Her voice was calm, but she didn't meet his eyes. Not because she was hiding, because she wasn't sure she could keep pretending she belonged. James was supposed to be in the schoolroom. Instead, he was crouched behind the pantry door, quietly eating a stolen apple tart and eavesdropping on the 2 kitchen maids. He hadn't planned to hear what he heard, but once he caught Rosalind's name, he stayed. "It's always the pretty ones," said the younger maid, Annie, her voice hushed but eager. "That's what Cook says. They smile and curtsy, but there's always something behind it." "You don't know that," the other maid replied. "Mrs. Newcombe wrote to Lady Bellingham directly, said the governess had been dismissed for undisclosed reasons, and that's never good. And now she's here, playing lady of the house." "The Duke wouldn't." "Wouldn't he? She's at his table, in his greenhouse. You've seen how he looks at her." "She seems kind." "That's how they get you." James stood, tart forgotten. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. Rosalind, the one person who hadn't lied to him, who didn't scold him for being loud or difficult, who let him speak like he was worth listening to. Someone had said she was bad, and worse. People believed it. He didn't know who Lady Bellingham was, but he hated her instantly. So he did what James Redmayne always did when something felt wrong. He broke something. It started with the harpsichord in the music room. He had only meant to slam the lid, but it cracked, loudly, echoingly. One of the old strings snapped, the sound sharp as a whip. A footman came running. James was already down the hall, knocking over a vase in the corridor for good measure. Mrs. Hargreaves found him in the library, standing on a chair, throwing books into a pile on the floor like a barricade. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. He didn't answer. She tried again, gentler this time. "James, what's going on?" "I don't want a new governess," he said. That stopped her. "No one said anything about a new... They're going to get rid of her." He looked up, flushed and furious. "They're saying awful things, and if Father hears them, he'll believe it, like everyone else." Mrs. Hargreaves stared at him, more startled by the why than the what. She didn't try to explain away the gossip. She knew better. She simply sent for Rosalind. Rosalind arrived minutes later, breathless from crossing the hall, to find James surrounded by chaos, books everywhere, vase shards on the carpet, and Mrs. Hargreaves trying to look composed despite the clear beginnings of a headache. "What on earth?" Rosalind began. "They're saying you're wicked," James burst out. "They're saying you're pretending, that you're not allowed to be here." Rosalind looked at him, and then at the others in the room. The footman, the maid, Mrs. Hargreaves. Silent, uncertain. No one would meet her eyes. She took a breath. "I see," she said. "Are they right?" James asked. "No," she said, steady, clear. "But that won't stop them talking." He looked like he might cry, but didn't. "I'll pack their trunks," he said. "All of them." "That won't be necessary." Mrs. Hargreaves cleared her throat. "His Grace will want to hear about this." And that, more than anything, changed the air in the room. Because for the first time since she'd arrived, Rosalind wasn't entirely sure what the Duke would believe. The Duke found her in the morning room. The fire was out. The air had gone cold, but Rosalind hadn't noticed. She stood by the window, her back straight, one hand resting on the sill. She didn't turn when he entered. "I hear there was an incident," he said. She didn't answer. He waited, then tried again. "James overturned half the library. I'm told it was... in protest." Now she turned. "Of me." His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. Less guarded. more alert. "What did he hear?" he asked. "That I'm not to be trusted, that my presence here reflects poorly on the house, that my history is questionable." A beat of silence. "Is it?" She blinked. The question wasn't cruel. He didn't raise his voice, but it landed with weight, precise and unforgiving. And it hurt, more than she expected. "You've read my references," she said evenly. "References can be bought. Reputation, less so." "That's what this is about, then?" she asked. "Reputation. This house is not—" He stopped, jaw tight. "It has already weathered enough scrutiny." Rosalind folded her arms. Not defensive, just done. "And you believe what's being said?" "I believe," he said carefully, "that something happened. That something always happens." "You don't even know what they're accusing me of?" "Then tell me." "No." He blinked, caught off guard. "Why not?" "Because it shouldn't matter," she said. "Because I've done nothing wrong. And if you need proof, if you need a confession or a clean story to justify trusting me, then this was never real. None of it." He didn't answer. Not right away. She turned back to the window. The frost had melted slightly at the edges of the glass. "I never lied to you," she said, softer now. "Not once." Still, he said nothing. And that silence, his silence, was the loudest answer he could have given. She nodded. "Just once." "Then I'll give my notice to Mrs. Hargreaves." She moved past him, steady, her skirts brushing the hardwood floor. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her with a quiet, final sound. The Duke stayed where he was, still as the frost outside. Chapter 7. Into the Snow. Rosalind packed quietly. She did not own much. A few dresses, a worn shawl, her books, a hairbrush with 2 missing bristles, the letter from Mrs. Newcombe still folded beneath her writing paper. She had not looked at it again. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. The storm was coming early. She folded her teaching notes into a leather folio. It would remain behind, for the next governess. It seemed the kindest thing she could offer. She did not cry. She simply packed, until she reached for her boots and found them gone. She stared at the empty space beside the wardrobe. The rest of her belongings were untouched. But the boots, plain leather, and the only good pair she owned, had vanished. She opened the wardrobe. Nothing. She checked beneath the bed. Nothing. And then she noticed the crumbs. A trail of them, leading out the door and toward the servants' staircase. Small, deliberate, utterly damning. "James," she murmured. Downstairs, she found her boots beneath a bench in the vestibule. They had been stuffed with goose feathers and tied together with twine. A half-finished note was crumpled inside one, written in thick, smudged pencil. "You can't leave. You're the only one who knows I hate porridge." Rosalind sat on the bench and simply breathed. Then came the sound of soft footsteps behind her. "You weren't supposed to find them until tomorrow," James said from the shadows. "I was meant to leave this morning," Rosalind replied. "You could forget," he said hopefully. "James." He did not look at her. "You don't want to go," he said. "I can tell. You like the greenhouse, and the books, and me." Her heart twisted. "I do like you," she said softly. "Very much. But liking someone doesn't always mean you get to stay." "Why not?" "Because adults do foolish things." James frowned. "Is this because of my father?" She didn't answer. "He makes mistakes too," James added, "but he's not as scary as he pretends." That made her laugh. "I'll talk to him," James said firmly. "I'll tell him you're good." "That's kind of you," she said, brushing his hair back from his forehead. But it's not your job to fix this. I always have to fix things, he whispered. There it was, tucked beneath all the mischief and bravado. Not defiance, fear. She didn't have the right words. So she did what someone ought to have done for him long ago. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him. This isn't your fault, she whispered. He didn't reply, but he didn't pull away. And for a moment, the hallway held still, as though even the storm outside had paused to listen. By mid-afternoon, the snow was falling hard. It came in fast, dense sheets, sweeping across the moors and burying the stone paths within minutes. The wind howled against the shutters, and even the dogs refused to be coaxed out for their usual rounds. Rosalind stood at the front doors, her packed bag beside her. She was dressed, gloved, ready, but she didn't move. The carriage won't make it through that, said Mrs. Hargreaves behind her. Rosalind didn't answer. The wind rattled the doors like someone trying to get in. You're not going anywhere tonight. She knew that, but somehow, hearing it aloud made her throat tighten. Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, then added more gently, He should have listened to you. Rosalind turned at that. But before she could reply, Mrs. Hargreaves's expression shifted, tightening with concern. And now James is gone. Rosalind went still. What do you mean, gone? We thought he was with you, the housekeeper said. About 10 minutes ago he slipped out through the servants' hall. No coat, no boots. She ran through the house, heart in her throat, calling his name down every corridor, through the schoolroom, the music room, the vestibule. She shouted toward the greenhouse, but the wind carried her voice away. No answer. She found his footprints in the snow, small, uneven, already half covered by the wind. They led toward the orchard, then beyond it. She didn't think. She simply followed. The snow caught in her hair, soaked the hem of her skirts, and bit through her gloves. Her boots slipped on the icy path, but she didn't stop. She followed the prints until they vanished into white. And then she shouted, louder this time, James, James! A voice came back. Miss Arden! She turned, breathless. The Duke stood 10 paces away, his coat thrown over a waistcoat, collar turned high against the wind. His hair was dusted with snow, his eyes swept the storm, sharp, urgent, wild. He's gone off, Rosalind began. I know, he said. I'm tracking the east side. The greenhouse, she said quickly. He might have gone there. That's where I'm headed. They moved together now, wordless, following instinct over reason. When they found James, he was in the cold frame beside the greenhouse, huddled under a patchy wool blanket, teeth chattering, face red with cold and stubborn pride. I wasn't going to leave, he muttered. I just didn't want anyone to leave me. The Duke dropped to one knee beside him. You idiot, he said softly, his voice cracking. You bloody little idiot. Then he pulled James into his arms and held on. Rosalind crouched beside them. She reached for James's hand. It was cold, but not numb. Let's get you inside, she whispered. The Duke's eyes found hers and held. No defences, no distance. Don't go, he said, low and steady. The snow had slowed by the time they reached the house. Rosalind helped peel James out of his wet clothes, while the housekeeper lit the fire in the nursery. The boy's lips were pale, his fingers stiff, but he was smiling through his shivers. See, he said, teeth chattering. Told you I'd win. You didn't win anything, Rosalind muttered, bundling him into a dry flannel nightshirt. You're lucky you still have toes. Not luck, strategy. She pressed a hand to his cheek, still cold, but warming. No more disappearing. Only if you stay. He was asleep before she could answer. Downstairs, the house was unusually still. Candles flickered in the sconces, casting long shadows across the walls. Rosalind turned the corner toward the front hall and stopped. The Duke was there. Leaning against the banister, jacket still damp from the snow, hair askew. He didn't look like a duke just now. He looked like a man who'd been standing in silence for too long, replaying things he wished he'd said. When he saw her, he straightened. But he didn't speak. Not yet. She walked past him toward the sitting room. He followed. The fire there had burned low. The room was warm, but dim. Rosalind didn't sit. Neither did he. "He's asleep," Rosalind said. "Good," the Duke replied. Silence settled between them. "You said not to trust you," he said. "If I needed your past to be clean." She didn't respond. "I wanted to believe I didn't need that it didn't matter, that I could let it go." Rosalind folded her arms. "But it did." "I did," he admitted quietly. He paused. "Because I was afraid." That made her look at him. "Afraid of scandal?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "No," he said. "Of wanting something again." The words hung in the air, quiet and heavy. He turned to the fire, jaw tight. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said. "I watched her slip away in a bed in this house. I buried her in the chapel behind the orchard. And then I buried everything else. My anger, my desire, my opinions, my goddamn heart. Because it was easier." Rosalind said nothing. "And then you walked in," he went on, "with your questions, your opinions, your bloody books about country mice and traps and greenhouse repairs. And I started to—" He broke off, not dramatically, just stopped. To want again, to feel again. And I didn't know what to do with it. He turned toward her, fully now. His expression was open, unguarded. "So I pushed it away," he said. "Pushed you away. And when the gossip started, I let myself believe it. Because that was safer than letting myself believe you." He took a breath, slow and uneven. "I'm not angry," he added, his voice rough. "I'm ashamed." Rosalind stepped closer, then again. "Do you know what I wanted that day?" she asked quietly. "When I stood in that room and you looked at me like I was something unpleasant you'd stepped in." "No," he said. "I wanted you to ask me anyway, even if you thought the worst. I wanted you to give me the chance to tell you the truth. I'm asking now." She held his gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "I was dismissed because I overheard something I wasn't meant to. A married man, one of the guests, making arrangements to meet his mistress. I said nothing. But his wife found out soon after. She guessed I'd overheard, and when I refused to confirm it, she took my silence as betrayal. I was let go, quietly, without a mark on paper, but plenty of whispers behind closed doors." The Duke didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "And now?" he asked. "Now I want to be done running from it." He drew a slow breath. "Stay." "As governess?" she asked. He shook his head. "As whatever you want to be." She almost smiled. "That's a terrible offer. I'm very out of practice." He stepped forward. Not rushed, not hesitant. "You're shaking," he said gently. "It's the snow," she replied. He paused, just for a moment. Then, without drama, without hesitation, he reached for her hand. Chapter 8. His Grief, Her Grace. The next morning dawned pale and still, the storm finally broken. Snowdrifts lined the windowsills, and the sky was the colour of pearl. But Wintour Hall felt warmer, not in temperature, but in weight. Something had shifted. Rosalind didn't see the Duke at breakfast. She didn't expect to. After the night before, she assumed he would retreat again. But just after midday, Mrs. Hargreaves knocked lightly on the schoolroom door. His Grace requests a word. Not commands, not summons, requests. He was waiting in the west corridor. She hadn't walked that hall since her first week, not since she'd found the locked doors and the painting beneath the sheet. Now he stood before the same doors, holding a key. "If you're going to stay," he said, "you should know everything." Rosalind said nothing. She only watched as he turned the key and opened the door. The room smelled of dust and lavender, preserved in silence. It had once been a private sitting room, elegant, feminine, untouched. A writing desk, a window seat, a half-sewn tapestry still in its hoop, waiting for hands that would never return. On the far wall hung a portrait. The one she'd seen before, only now it was fully uncovered. The late Duchess. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the delicate, fragile way Rosalind had imagined. There was boldness in her expression, a sharpness around the mouth. The brushstrokes captured an intelligence that startled her. This had been no quiet wife. She hated being idle, the Duke said softly. She read everything, wrote letters to editors, designed this room herself. She used to correct my parliamentary speeches. Rosalind stepped closer to the painting. "She looks like she spoke her mind." She did. A long pause. Then, "She died of a fever. 3 years ago. It was sudden. One day she was tired. The next, she was gone." Rosalind looked at him. He wasn't watching the portrait anymore. "We thought it was nothing at first. A chill. Too much time in the garden. But by the time the doctor arrived, she was already fading." "And you still blamed yourself," Rosalind said quietly. He exhaled, sharp and quiet. "I told her to rest, to stay indoors, but she wouldn't. She said the roses needed tending and that no one else could coax them into blooming. I let her go. I should have stopped her." Rosalind didn't speak. She just listened. "She was everything to James," he said. "She kept him close. Wouldn't let anyone else feed him. Wouldn't even consider a wet nurse. And He stopped. "I didn't know how to fill that space after she was gone." "Because you see her in him." He nodded. "And the part of her I couldn't save." For a moment, the only sound was the wind outside, soft against the glass. Rosalind stepped closer until she stood beside him, not touching, just near enough that he could feel she was there. "That's not guilt," she said gently. "That's grief." "There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "One keeps you frozen. The other lets you mourn." He didn't answer, but he didn't move away. He lit the fire himself. The grate was dusty, but the coals caught easily, as if the room had been waiting to be warm again. When the flame steadied, the Duke stepped back, his shoulders easing just slightly. The room felt different now. Not restored, not healed, but no longer sealed shut. They sat in silence for a moment, he on the velvet settee, Rosalind in a nearby chair. The portrait watched from the wall, not accusing, not forgiving, simply present. "I haven't been in here in over a year," the Duke said. "And yet nothing's been disturbed," Rosalind replied. "I told the staff to leave it," he said. "I thought it was respect. But I just didn't want anyone else touching it." Rosalind let her gaze move slowly around the room. A writing desk, a window seat, the half-finished tapestry still in its hoop. James says he doesn't remember her, she said. He was 2, the Duke murmured, eyes on the fire. But he feels the absence, Rosalind said. He carries the silence around her like something heavy. His jaw tightened. I thought keeping her memory sacred meant shielding him from it. Instead, I turned her into something unreachable. He doesn't need a saint, she said quietly. He just needs to know she was loved. The fire shifted. Wood settled. I'm tired, the Duke said. Not of the day, of the years. Tired of holding myself still, he went on. Of pretending that grief has only one shape. Of moving through this house like, if I open the wrong door, she'll be there. He turned toward her then. Not guarded now. Not careful. But when I look at you, he said, I don't feel like I'm betraying her. Rosalind's breath caught. I just feel like I'm breathing again, the Duke finished. He stood and crossed to the window, resting one hand on the frame, the other loose at his side. You asked if I believed you, he said, without looking back. When the gossip reached me. I did, Rosalind said. I didn't answer, he said. No, she agreed. I do, he said, finally turning to face her. I believe you. Rosalind rose from the chair, not hurried, just present. And you? He asked. Do you believe me, now that you've seen all of this? Yes, she said, without hesitation. The Duke's eyes closed briefly, not in retreat, but in relief. And when he opened them, the space between them felt changed. Not smaller, just honest. They stood in silence. Rosalind near the fire, the Duke by the window, his hand still on the frame like it tethered him to something solid. You don't owe me belief, Rosalind said quietly. I don't offer it lightly, the Duke replied. The fire snapped. Outside, a low wind brushed against the windows, soft as a hand tracing old lines in the glass. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said. You mean me? Rosalind asked. All of it, he admitted. She didn't smile. Do you think I meant to lose my heart to a grieving Duke with too much sorrow in his eyes? That did make him smile, barely. I suppose not, he said. He stepped closer, 2 steps, then one more. Rosalind could feel his nearness now, not imposing, not demanding, just there. You're not what I expected, he said, his voice low. Neither are you, she replied. His hand brushed against hers, a tentative thing, a test. She didn't move. When he touched her cheek, fingers gentle, almost reverent, it was like he was asking a question he didn't quite know the words for. She answered by leaning in, not far, just enough. He kissed her then, not like a man claiming anything, not like someone drowning. He kissed her like someone who hadn't been sure he still could, and she kissed him back like someone who hadn't let herself want this for years. It was slow, unhurried, the kind of kiss that didn't try to promise anything beyond what it was. When they parted, neither of them stepped back right away. His hand remained at her cheek. Her breath, unsteady, lingered in the space between them. I shouldn't have done that, he said, after a moment. No, Rosalind agreed, but you did. And now everything's changed. Rosalind looked up at him. Not everything, she said. But they both knew something had. Because when he finally let her go and she stepped back into the hall, the air behind her felt warmer, lighter, and not just from the fire. Chapter 9. A Governess No More. She found him in the morning room. He stood by the hearth, hands behind his back, posture taut with the kind of restraint that always came before something unpleasant. Rosalind, he said. She folded her hands in front of her and met his gaze. Your Grace. A flicker passed over his face at the formality. I've made a decision, he said, about your position here. Her stomach dipped, but she said nothing. James is settled, happier than I've seen him in years, and He hesitated. I'd like you to remain at Wintour, not as governess. She lifted her chin. As what, then? As companion. To the household. To me. A pause. You'd have rooms of your own. Comfort, privacy, discretion. The silence that followed wasn't still. It was sharp. Rosalind stared at him. You're offering me a quiet life, she said slowly. Tucked away, without name, without title, but with enough dresses and fires and private corridors that no one would dare question it. He flinched. That's not... You're asking me to be your mistress. No. Yes, she snapped. You are. She crossed to the centre of the room, fury rising now, not because he desired her, but because he thought so little of what she'd endured, what she was. You think because you kissed me once, because I've been kind to your child, that I'll be grateful enough to stay here quietly while you ease your conscience and keep your reputation intact? Rosalind, I came here with nothing, not even a name worth defending. And I worked for your respect, your trust. I taught your son to read. I made your house a home again. Her voice caught, but she didn't soften. And you offer me what? A well-appointed cage? A life without a door? He looked stunned, not defensive, just stunned. Like he hadn't realized the words would sound like this once they left his mouth. I thought I was giving you a choice, he said, low. Then let me choose. No? And she turned her back on him. Her hands were shaking, but not from regret, only from the heat of what she would no longer carry. The cottage wasn't hers, not really. It belonged to a widow named Mrs. Cray, who kept bees in the summer and brewed strong, bitter tea in the winter. She had a kind face and more rooms than she needed, and when Rosalind had asked after lodgings in the village, she'd simply nodded and said, Front room's got a bed and a stove. You can earn your keep by helping with the preserves. So Rosalind stayed. She swept, cooked when asked, helped mend the bee-skeps. And in exchange, Mrs. Cray offered her the use of the old parlour for lessons. By the end of the first week, 4 village children were arriving every morning, muddy boots, inky fingers, eager minds. Rosalind brought what she could from Wintour Hall, slates, books, leftover paper from the schoolroom. She borrowed a kettle, mended mittens, sat on the floor beside a boy who hated reading and traced letters with him until the fear in his eyes began to ease. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for the first time in months, no one looked at her sideways in the street. Whatever the rumours had been, they hadn't followed her here. The villagers didn't care where she'd come from. They cared that she showed up each day, that she had patience, that she noticed when children were tired or hungry or quiet in the wrong kind of way. She didn't need to be called Miss Arden. She didn't even need a title. She just needed to be useful. And yet, James came anyway. The first time, he arrived holding the hand of a red-faced groom who looked mortified to be accompanying the young master on a social call. I'm just checking on the biscuits, James announced. The second time, he came with a basket from the Wintour kitchens and informed Rosalind that it was for the poor children who can't spell. Mrs. Cray gave him a sour look, but accepted the gift. By the third visit, the footman who brought him simply waited outside. I told Father I wanted to see the village, James said, grinning. I just didn't say where exactly. He'll notice, Rosalind said, wiping mud from his stockings. He already has. She looked up. He knows you're here. James shrugged. He hasn't stopped me. Rosalind turned back to the lesson at hand, a little girl struggling to shape the curve of an R. But her heart beat faster. By the 5th visit, James was helping the youngest count using biscuits. He was terrible at it because he kept eating them. But he made them laugh. And one afternoon, as she watched him crouch beside a tiny girl too afraid to read aloud, curling himself protectively around her like a small knight guarding treasure, Rosalind realised. She had never stopped loving him, even if she'd walked away from the house. The Duke did not come to the cottage on purpose. Or at least, that's what he told himself when he asked the groom to saddle his horse. Then turned, slowly, deliberately, down the path that curved past the church, along the ridge, and into the valley where the old stone-walled cottage stood beneath the trees. The one Rosalind had gone to. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she left Wintour Hall without looking back. The nursery stayed quiet. The schoolroom remained untouched. No new governess had arrived. No one had been hired, or perhaps no one dared take her place. James hadn't said much either. Only, "I told Father I wanted to see the village," he said with a grin. "I just didn't say where exactly." And every afternoon he returned with muddy boots, a fresher mood, and chalk in his hair. So now the Duke stood at the edge of the trees, his boots sinking slightly into the thawing earth, looking toward the cottage he had not meant to find. It was smaller than he remembered. Moss on the roof. A crooked gate. Smoke curling from the chimney. Through the front window, golden in the late afternoon light, he could just make out the flicker of a fire. And in front of it, her. Rosalind sat on a cushion on the floor, surrounded by books, slates, and the quiet chaos of children at work. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. One child leaned against her shoulder, listening intently, while another tried, unsuccessfully, to shape the alphabet on a cracked bit of slate. A boy with a crooked fringe was eating jam straight from the jar. And James, seated on a low stool, legs crossed, reading aloud, not pretending, not performing, just reading. And he looked happy. Not in the careful, composed way Alexander had come to expect, but openly, unhidden. Rosalind corrected his pronunciation gently, touched his arm when he faltered, and smiled when he reached the end of the paragraph. A real smile, quiet, proud, full of warmth. There was no claim in it. Only care. Alexander felt it in his chest. That ache. Not of jealousy, not even of longing, but of recognition. This woman, dismissed, doubted, shut out, had made herself essential, not by asking, not by yielding, but by doing what she always had, helping, without needing permission. And he had tried to contain her, to offer her quiet rooms and gentler expectations, walls disguised as comfort, safety if she would only shrink to fit within it. He had thought it was enough. He had been wrong. Because what he saw now, framed in firelight and dusk, was a woman complete on her own. Not waiting to be chosen, not hoping to be kept. He turned away, walked back through the trees, snow melting beneath his boots, the scent of thaw in the air. If he came to her now, it could not be to offer shelter. It could only be to offer himself, unshielded, without terms, without pretense. And if she turned him away, he would have earned it. But if she didn't, then perhaps, at last, he might be ready for something real. Chapter 10. The Winter Breaks. The shutters came down first, one by one, across the north-facing windows, then the south. Mrs. Hargreaves gave the order for the heavy velvet drapes to be tied back. The windows were opened, just an inch, to allow the air to move once more. It still carried the chill of late winter, but there was birdsong now. Meltwater trickled across the stones, and beneath the frost, the faintest scent of something green. Wintour Hall was waking up. The gallery was dusted, the greenhouse scrubbed. Fires still burned in most rooms, but not to chase away the cold, only to temper it. The long unused dining room was aired, the place settings restored. His Grace gave no instructions. He simply did not stop them. Alexander had begun walking the house again, not as he once had, not as a man patrolling his dominion, but quietly, unhurriedly, noticing a faded water stain in the music room ceiling, a forgotten vase in the corridor to the east wing. James's shoes, too small now, lined neatly by the front door, one still bearing a splash of ink. Rosalind's ink. She had not returned, and he had not sent for her. Not yet. Because now, finally, he understood what kind of man he would need to be for such an invitation to matter. Her absence was no longer a wound. It was a presence. He found it in the schoolroom, where her handwriting still lingered on the lesson slate. He found it in James's offhand remarks. Miss Arden says frogs must be ugly to be wise, or with the certainty only a child could possess. Miss Arden wouldn't let anyone eat biscuits before they earned them. She was not haunting the house. She was woven into it. And nothing he had done, no silence, no routine, no distance, had been able to replace that. Not until he changed. Not until now. By late morning, James was gone. Not missing. Gone. His boots, coat, and satchel had vanished from the hall. So had a loaf of bread, a jar of Mrs. Hargreaves's jam, and 2 apples from the kitchen bin. The Duke didn't panic. Not immediately. But by the time a stable hand reported seeing James leading his pony down the main road, alone and with a suspiciously smug expression on his face, His Grace's voice had gone tight. "Saddle my horse." Mrs. Hargreaves appeared on the front steps as the Duke pulled on his gloves. "He's gone to her," she said, not accusing, just stating what everyone already knew. "I know," the Duke replied. She hesitated, then added, "He left me a note." The Duke looked at her. "I thought he was being cheeky," she said. "If I'd known he meant it, I'd have gone after him myself." "Shall I send one of the men?" "No." He stepped down onto the path. "I'll go myself." He didn't gallop. He didn't need to. The road to the cottage was rutted but clear, and when he reached it, the small garden gate was swinging open in the wind. He dismounted and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. This time a scuffling sound came from inside. Then the door opened just a crack. James stood there, smiling, jam on his cheek. "I ran away," he announced. "I see that," said the Duke. "I packed supplies. I brought books." "Did you?" "I left a note." "To whom?" "Mrs. Hargreaves. It said, 'Tell father I have made other arrangements.'" The Duke stared at him. James blinked up at him, innocently. "I've decided to live here now. Miss Arden needs help with the children, and the fire's warmer." From behind him, Rosalind's voice called, "James." She appeared in the doorway behind the boy, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with cold, or something else. She looked tired, beautiful, and wholly unsurprised. "He showed up an hour ago," Rosalind said to the Duke, "with a basket, a plan, and a very serious face." "He's persistent," the Duke replied. "He's manipulative." "I'm helpful," James said proudly. Rosalind didn't argue. The Duke looked between them. A woman who had walked away with her head held high, a boy who had followed her without hesitation, and himself, finally understanding that if he wished to step into this picture, he would have to do it with humility. He crouched beside James. "You can't just disappear," the Duke said gently. "You frightened everyone half to death." "I left a note." "Not the same." James looked at him. then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Here, you can read it later." He pressed it into the Duke's hand and disappeared into the cottage. Rosalind stayed behind. They were alone now, for the first time in weeks. The Duke didn't move. "He planned this," he said. "Yes." "To force my hand." "Obviously." A pause. "Was it the jam that gave him away?" Rosalind huffed, almost a laugh. "He brought a note. Said it was for you. I haven't read it." Rosalind stood on the stone step, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair tugged loose by the wind. The doorway framed her in golden light, the warmth of the hearth spilling out into the dimming afternoon. The Duke remained on the path. Not too far. Not close enough to reach her. Just far enough to speak plainly. "I came for him," he said softly. "But I stayed for you." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. "Since you left, the house has been quiet. Too quiet. As though it's holding its breath." He inhaled carefully, like a man trying not to falter. "But I think it is I who have changed." She tilted her head. "You took your time." He offered a faint, rueful smile. "I had to become someone worth returning to." That softened her, just slightly, but still she didn't move. "And now I know what I want." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the folded paper James had slipped into his hand. He held it out. She took it. "I did this because Father is very slow," she read aloud. "And he overthinks things. And he likes you, but he's scared." Her throat tightened. "Is he wrong?" Rosalind asked softly. The Duke gave a small, rueful smile. "About me being slow? No." He paused, then added more quietly. "But about liking you? No. He's not wrong about that either." Rosalind looked at him then, her gaze steady. "And what is it you want, Your Grace?" The Duke hesitated, then shook his head once. "No more titles. Not for this." There was a silence between them, low and waiting. "I should like," he said quietly, "to hear you call me Alexander, if you're willing." She regarded him, long enough that the wind stirred again. Then, "Very well, Alexander." His eyes closed briefly, not in retreat, but in relief. He opened them again, gaze clear. "I want to be the man who deserves you, not because I am a duke, not because you were kind to my son, but because when I see you, for exactly who you are, I know I have never admired anyone more." The wind caught the edge of her blanket. Her hands remained still. He stepped closer. "I'm not asking you to return as governess, or hostess, or companion. I'm not asking you to mend the house, or James, or me." Another breath, measured. "Sure. I am asking if there is space in your heart for me, not as a position, but as a partner." A quiet pause. Rosalind looked down at the note once more, then at him. "And if I say yes, then I shall spend the rest of my life making certain I have earned it." She stepped down from the threshold into the frost-damp grass. He met her there. They did not embrace, not at first. She simply stood in front of him, close enough that their breath mingled in the cold air. "You are still very slow," she murmured. "But worth waiting for?" he asked. Her eyes crinkled just slightly. "We shall see." And then she leaned in, not desperate, not uncertain, just sure. This kiss felt more natural, more intimate, not because of repetition, but because they now fully understood their feelings for one another. When they drew apart, neither spoke. And then, a small voice called from the doorway behind them. Are you finished? They turned. James stood on the step, arms folded, expression far too smug for someone missing his front tooth. Because I'm hungry, he added, and if this is going to take all day, I'm going to need another biscuit. Rosalind laughed, soft, surprised, unguarded. The Duke glanced at her. Your pupil is demanding. She smiled up at him. He takes after his father. The Duke reached for her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. And as they turned toward the cottage, toward the boy and the hearth and the uncertain, hopeful shape of something new, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Epilogue, Wintour reclaimed. Summer arrived early in Northumberland that year, and with it a kind of gentle abundance. By June, the orchards surrounding Wintour Hall were heavy with green and gold. Roses tumbled riotously over old stone walls, and bees hummed in the lavender beds near the south terrace. The once-abandoned greenhouse now flourished, its panes gleaming in the sunlight, the air within fragrant with basil, violets, and the soft citrus bloom of a lemon tree that had, at last, yielded to Rosalind's coaxing hand. On a sun-washed afternoon in mid-June, after a quiet ceremony in the Wintour family chapel, they stepped into the south garden to receive their guests beneath a trellis of honeysuckle and early summer roses, the air fragrant, the day radiant with warmth and colour. The Duke of Wintour stood in a finely tailored navy coat, his expression one of quiet astonishment, as though even now he scarcely believed she had truly said yes. Rosalind wore a gown of soft ivory muslin, high-waisted and gently pleated, with short, fluttering sleeves and a lace-edged neckline that framed her collarbones with delicate modesty. Her veil, light as thistledown, cascaded down her back, and in her hair, swept up with quiet elegance, she wore a crown of small white blossoms. No jewels, no ornaments but the rosemary sprig tucked just behind one ear. It was James who gave her away. Since father needed the help, he proclaimed solemnly, his voice just loud enough to stir chuckles from the front row. She bent and kissed the crown of his head. The vows were brief, sincere, spoken without hesitation. They exchanged them beneath the blossoms, voices steady, eyes fixed only on each other. No grand declarations were needed, only the quiet certainty of two people who had already weathered enough to know what they were promising. Afterward, the guests spilled into the garden, where parasols bobbed between rose bushes and laughter mingled with the hum of bees. Footmen passed silver trays laden with elderflower cordial, champagne, and neat squares of lemon syllabub in glass dishes. On the trestle tables, beneath white linen cloths, an abundant summer feast was laid. Roasted chicken with herbs from the kitchen garden, cucumber sandwiches, potted shrimp, and cold sliced beef with horseradish. There were bowls of ripe strawberries and raspberries, clotted cream piled high, and delicate sugar biscuits shaped like flowers. The strawberry tarts vanished first, just as James predicted. Mrs. Hargreaves wept openly into her napkin after her second glass of champagne. Mrs. Cray, from Rosalind's former cottage, brought 4 village children, each in shoes of wildly different sizes, and James made certain every one of them had a tart in each hand. In the dappled shade beneath the hedge, the Duke stood beside his new wife and murmured, almost to himself, "You've made this place breathe again." She nudged his elbow. "We did." He looked down at her. "You're not becoming sentimental, are you?" "Certainly not," she replied, though she smiled as she said it. Later, when the sun hung low and golden over the hills and the last of the guests had gone, they walked the quiet halls of Wintour together. The ancestral portraits still lined the stairwell, but the doors were open now, the shutters raised, and the summer light moved freely through the rooms, as though it had only ever waited for permission to return. In the garden below, James darted through the long grass, trailing a ribbon and shouting something in Latin about frogs. His laughter rang bright against the stone. Rosalind leaned gently into Alexander's side as they looked out over the garden below, where James dashed through the grass, a ribbon trailing behind him, his laughter echoing bright against the stone. Alexander's hand found hers. "All is just as it should be," he murmured. She turned her face toward him, smiling softly. "For the first time," she said. "It truly is." They stood in companionable silence as the last light of day stretched across the hall's open windows, gilding the floorboards and warming the walls. And somewhere between that moment and the next, Wintour ceased to be merely a place they lived. It became a home they had made, together. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. New tales drop every Tuesday, or on Sundays if you're one of the clever few who've tapped the join button. If you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, you can tap that thanks button right below. It's far less scandalous than slipping coins into a reticule. I'll be back soon with another story, unless I've been spirited away by moonlight and mischief.